What's up, and welcome to the show. It's JF Hicks, and guess who's on the show today? It's Tai M. Brown. Now, if you listen to podcasts in the sports space, then you know that Tai hosts the One Question Leadership podcast, where he hosts conversations about executive and organizational leadership. He has an amazing mind on leadership and a longtime friend. Can't say enough good things about him. Tai was with the American Football Coaches Association for 13 years as its director of education, where he put together conventions with over 7,000 attendees. That was 7,000 coaches and over 200 speakers. He's also co-author of The Blueprint for a Successful Career, and he's also the managing editor for Athletic Director U. One interesting thing about Tai is he was a walk-on football player at Michigan State, where he eventually earned a full ride scholarship. Now, guess who the coach was at the time? You guessed it, none other than Coach Nick Saban. That alone tells you a lot about Tai Brown. Now, the tables have been turned, and I'm on the hot seat as the guest on the Sports Creators podcast. Never thought this would happen in a million years. It's Tai Brown interviewing yours truly. The topic is why I started the Sports Creators podcast for our community. The questions are raw and real, and get to the core of what we're doing at the Sports Creators podcast. I hope you enjoy the show. A big thank you to Tai for hosting the show. I know you'll listen to this interview and run right over to Tai's One Question Leadership podcast and subscribe to his show on your favorite podcast app. Please give him a shout out on the internet. He's at Tai M. Brown. You can find him. You know how to use the internet. Tai is a force of nature. And so with that, I'll get out the way.
Greetings, this is Tai Brown, and I am the host of the One Question podcast, where we highlight executive leaders in college athletics. I have commandeered the Sports Creative podcast. JF Hicks invited me over just to have a conversation with him about leadership and those kind of things, and I convinced him to take out the mics. And right now, I'm a guest host here on the Sports Creative podcast, and I'm happy to be here. And our guest is JF Hicks. Jay, thanks for letting me host the podcast.
Tai, and I have to say you did commandeer the show. And I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all that you do in the Sports Creative space. And, it really is different being in this seat rather than asking the question.
Right. It's different, right? When you're not hosting, when you're interviewing, it's a big difference.
Oh, it is. It really is.
Excellent. Well, what I know about you, Jay, is that you have methodically built a resume of someone who is very knowledgeable about the industry that is creativity in sports, right? Whether it's graphic design, video, social media. Talk to me about what that industry entails, because a lot of people don't understand the intricacies of the sports creators.
No, that's a great question, Ty. I think the sports creative industry, first of all, it's a booming industry right now. You're talking about photographers. You're talking to take the photos at games and all the social photos that you see. We're also talking about videographers that are shooting and editing all of this. We're also talking about a lot of what we call motion graphics. Those are things that move around. There's a lot of things moving on the screen. Those are motion people. And then you need just, your standard, really good graphic designer that helps you bring it all together. And then you also have usually a digital strategist who helps come up with the strategy for, not just putting out a lot of content, but like, what's the story? What are we trying to achieve? And making sure we're going down that road. And then usually, I think also having a project manager is good within the creative space. And then I also like to include, the social person who's ever sharing all of this content. So that's kind of what I consider the creative space and the people who help come up with those ideas.
I'd imagine the last person you mentioned, the social person, or even a website kind of designer. There's the aspect of people coming up with content, people planning the content, but then there also has to be the person who's in charge of distributing the content, and that's kind of what that social person is, and that kind of thing is too, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a key person. Sometimes, within in business world and within sports teams, sometimes that individual, that position is buried a little bit. But what's really important is we spend a lot of time on content creation and ideation. and then we execute it. And then sometimes, individuals or groups sometimes drop the ball on that last step, right? Because one of the great interviews I did with Coach Rule, and, I was talking to him about why he has this creative team, in a old converted position room. And so he was talking about his theory on proximity, right? And so one of the things he says, if you're around the program all the time and you know what the brand is and why we're doing it, it's easier to tell the story if you know the story.
If you're entrenched, of course, Coach Rule is the head football coach at Baylor University.
Right.
It's interesting to me, the creatives industry, right? I've had graphic designers on that helped me do a lot of things back when I was with the American Football Coaches Association. I've watched a lot of work you do and a lot of people who work around you. A lot of times creatives just want to do the work. They're not interested in the aspirational aspects of career development. It's like, let me create, let me be who I am, and pay me for my services, and I'll keep doing what I need to do. But in the current times, with the importance of how things are distributed, social media, internet, video, all the things you mentioned, it probably takes a little more than just being able to do your craft nowadays.
I do. And one thing, Ty, I do think is I do think, it's not that I don't think creatives aren't interested. I don't think it's maybe something that comes up often.
Okay.
So maybe, one of the things that on this journey I've been on with the Sports Creatives podcast is really to have that conversation and that dialogue, because I think a lot of times when people are intentional about their careers and intentional about the jobs that they take and the opportunities that they take, then those things come up. So I think you've seen it in other areas of college sports, right? The SIDs have a professional group, and athletic directors have athletic director U, and they have these people who are helping them. And so I think what's happening is that the sports creative industry is really booming. And so it's creating new opportunities, new jobs. And so really, if you go back, within the sports realm, there hasn't been an opportunity. You'd have one graphic designer and they did everything for you. Well, so now we have all these positions that need leadership. And so to answer the second part of your question, I do think to be a leader, now you're having to take the technical skills, because you need to be good at what you do, and then figure out, how am I a leader? How do I motivate people? How do I create an environment? How do I grow other people's careers? And those aren't necessarily natural things. I think everybody's dealing with that. So I think it's really, you can see it in the creative space because the growth is so exponential, especially with recruiting and what it's doing to college sport.
It's growing super fast.
Super fast.
Exponentially, like you said. I worked for a long time with the American Football Coaches Association, and the gestation period of a coach in college, we'll say graduate assistant, you might get a position coaching job, you're there for a few years, you might get a coordinator job, you might do that for a few years, you might get a head coaching job.
Right.
So the gestation period. And in football, obviously competition, athletic people are motivated to try to be the best. So they probably would be motivated to become leaders and to have more influence over a football team.
Right.
I don't know does that exist in the creative industry, in the creative space. In football, the development of leadership is a natural outgrowth of being competitive and being athletic. And you're also leading a bunch of young men, or women for that fact, in any sport. But how would that exist in the creative space? I guess you'd have to identify the folks who have leadership qualities and say, hey, look, at some point, if you want to move your career forward, or if you want to help out other people in the industry, you have to learn some of these intangible things in addition to your trade and what you do and your talent.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. I think what needs to happen is that creatives need to take and that's already happening with communities and conversations that are happening about leadership positions. Because what would happen if creatives don't take up is maybe more people who are marketing or sales driven or things, or other types of communicators who aren't always involved in the creative process. They could take those leadership positions if sports creatives, don't, step up and learn those skills. But what we're seeing across the country is that the brands, I think, who do it really well in the college space and in the pro space is that there are those leaders and there are some individuals. But what we're needing is just continual growth on that. So in terms of that gestation process that you're asking, in terms of today, because of the growth, because college has been around football's been around for 100 years, right? So there's a long history there. And within the sports creative space, it's happening at the speed of light, right? So it's kind of like when the internet started in the 90s and there was all these startups. Well, that's where we are. We're in this fast growth place. So what we need to do is establish that gestation And I think that would start at the internship process for a lot of people, because a lot of creatives are self-taught. Some of them go to college, but some of the best creatives I know of don't have an art degree, right? But they're extremely talented. So I think you can put it in that process of the internship process. And so that's where I think, how that process would happen. And then I think what has to happen is that it's also about creatives educating the leadership in sports across the board, college and pros, to say, hey, it's not just say, hey, where's my graphic, hit my deadline, where's my video, and understanding like, look, we have to create an environment where people want to stay, because one of the things that's happening is right now the growth is so incredible that people are contacting individuals about opportunities, not just waiting for people to apply. So it's really competitive right now. So if you're an organization, it would behoove you to make sure that you're developing, your creatives, helping them see where their path is. Because I do think you're right. And when people don't know what their path is, they take what they feel like is the best opportunity for them and for their families or themselves.
Which it may not be. You brought up something interesting there, the leadership in terms of athletic directors, or you talk about corporations, but just specifically in sports, right. Athletic directors, general managers, whoever it is in the sports space, the people who hire these creatives to be on their staff. I saw a job description one time and it said, we're looking for a video person. They wanted a video person, and it said, you may have some opportunities to work with football in a quality control aspect. So that was kind of a coaching thing. We also need this person to understand how to develop and make graphics, web design, and then main job would be video.
Wow.
When I looked at that, I thought that sounds like 3 or 4 or 5 different jobs.
Right.
But I don't think that was the only job description out there that was like that when you talk about creatives. And what that showed me is whoever put that together doesn't necessarily understand what creatives do and how much work it is to do each one of those specific things that was listed.
Yeah, and I think off the top, that means there probably wasn't a creative involved with writing that job description. And then I think it goes back to the education piece of educating the leadership of what's necessary to happen and making sure that you have somewhat of a work-life balance. I mean, you don't get one in general in sports, but to ask sports creatives to work 70 and 80 hour weeks, is that sustainable? Could someone do that for 5 years? And so again, one of the things that, you'll see with coaching, I think in coaching, when you look at it by the numbers, generally the longer a coach is there, longer stable of coach have been there, the greater your chances are for success, right? And the teams that aren't as successful have a lot of turnover, right? At the coaching level, the AD level, the president level. So I think it gets back to that, like, how can you create a great, consistent brand? And so it comes back to, really educating the leadership about how important understanding what creatives do. And I think in terms of moving forward, if you look at recruiting on the college side, and then, really everyone's dealing with sales tickets in decline, right? Everybody's been a soft decline in the last 4 to 5 years. So that's pushing the revenue on the sports side. But to really be a great leader, and you have to do both those things, right? You have to recruit talent on the college side, and you have to sell tickets. So to be in leadership, I think what is going to be great is when we have a series of leaders who grew up in digital, who grew up in that space and understand. I think that's your next level of leadership. And I think the coaches will really appreciate it on both sides, because they're both, then you're rowing in the same direction. You actually can help the coach execute what it is they're trying to do in terms of their brand and recruiting people and retaining them.
Well, it sounds like, from what I know, I've listened to this podcast, and I'm glad you let me be a guest host here on the Sports Creative Podcast. But the things you do and the people you have on, it sounds to me that this resource, the Sports Creative Podcast itself, and a lot of the people that you have on understand that there's an educational process for a lot of the creatives. And I think the purpose of what you're doing, the why, is actually great for that whole entire industry of sports creatives.
Yeah. I mean, the goal is really, it's just about you giving back to a community that's birthed my career. And I think about the people at the first part of my career that helped me navigate, and it's changed. And so what we have to do as, and I think everybody's a leader in some form or fashion, right? Everyone's leading and being led. So it's our ability as creatives to give back to our community and take some ownership, because I think if you look historically, creatives haven't always done a great job of controlling the business side, right? I mean, how many times do we turn on the news and there's an artist who made, who revolutionized the world that broke. So for I think where we are is helping, our creatives understand their value. And then if you know your value, then you know where you're going. And then you can also create better value, right? Because I was listening to an interview today. It was saying when someone hits stress, right, it reduces their ability to create great work. So if sports creatives are stressed about work, they're stressed about their deadlines, they don't know where their career's going, you're not getting what you recruited them for, which was the top end work. So the Sports Creatives Podcast really it's really for me to give back to the community and really invest and have. It's the best part has been really the relationships and talking to people. I love talking to people about who are really good at what they do, about how do they create this great environment.
Right. Well, this has been an excellent conversation, Jared. I really appreciate you allowing me to host the Sports Creative Podcast.
Thanks, Ty, and I really appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
That was J.F. Hicks. He's the host of the Sports Creative Podcast, and of course, he allowed me to guest host this episode here. My name is Ty Brown. I'm the host of the One Question Podcast, and keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today.
All right, that wraps it up. A couple of things before we get out of here. The Sports Creatives Podcast is found on sportscreativespodcast.com. I'm JF Hicks. You can find me using the handle @JAY, the letter F, Hicks. That's JF Hicks all over social media and the internet. Leave a comment or a question, and I'll respond as soon as possible. Let's connect.